A word of warning, this podcast explores graphic and disturbing stories and includes some strong language. It therefore may not be suitable for our young listeners or other folks who may find it disturbing. Hello and welcome to a special edition of True Crime News, the podcast. I'm your host, Ana Garcia. Everyone in the world of true crime has a story to tell about a case they worked or they lived through. Some are high profile, some you've never heard of, but they are all fascinating. Today's case you have for sure heard of. It is about serial killer Ted Bundy and his relationship with his cousin. When a serial killer is identified and caught, everyone asks the same question. How did the family not know? As we have learned, many killers are very skilled at hiding their secrets and their double lives. Ted Bundy's reign of terror gripped this country partly because he was smart, educated, charming, and a lot of people just could not believe that this nice law student was the one responsible for such brutality. Bundy confessed to more than 30 murders, and authorities say they've confirmed about 20, but there could be more. So much has been written about Ted Bundy, and so much focus on his childhood. Ted was born out of wedlock to a young mother in 1946. Early on, he was adopted and lived with his grandparents, and they told people that his mother was his sister. Ultimately, she married a man who gave Ted his last name of Bundy, and he grew up in a fairly normal, middle-class family surrounded by cousins. One of those cousins has written a new book called Dark Tide, Growing Up with Ted Bundy. Our guests today are Edna Cowell Martin, Ted's cousin, and writer Megan Atkinson, who helped Edna tell this deeply personal and genuinely disturbing story. Welcome. It is such a pleasure to have both of you on the program.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Great to be here.
We were just chatting, Edna, before we started recording about how everyone always asks you the same question. Were there any signs? Were there any signs?
Right. You know, Ted and Ted's family and our family were really close because, as you described, she moved out to the Pacific Northwest, and my parents and Louise, his mom, were all from Philadelphia. So anyway, my dad wrote her a letter urging her to come out, just as you described. She was what they call an unwed mother, had a child out of wedlock, which was a much more frowned upon situation back in the 40s, as you can imagine. So she picked up and made that big trip across the United States with a 4-year-old little boy and ended up moving in with my family, at my parents' house with my brother, too, who was 4 years old at the same time. I wasn't born yet. I wasn't born till the following year. So they lived with our family for almost a year and then did what you said. She got married and had 4 more kids. We had events together, family events. We were the Bundys, Louise's only relatives in the area. So we had a cabin on the beach. They would come out and spend weekends with us, and we would play on the beach. And I saw Ted a lot during that time. He was 5 years older than I am, so he spent a lot of time with my brother because those two guys hung out.
Yeah.
And I was mainly with the younger kids. But, I mean, he seemed perfectly normal during that time of his life. I don't know what happened during the teenage years because we moved away for a while and then came back. And then I moved back to Seattle to attend the University of Washington, where I finished up my junior and senior year. And those were the crucial times of fall of 72 through 1974. And 1974, from January to July, through July, is when he started committing all those murders in Washington.
It's amazing the way, Edna, you described really what sounds like every family, cousins getting together, all that stuff. Megan, when you hear something so absolutely normal, does that almost set the backdrop for you? Because it's in this, it's just like this, it just doesn't make sense.
It's so relatable, so incredibly relatable. Edna would tell stories about the times when her cousins would come over, the Bundys would come over to visit for the day at the cabin, the things that they would do, and the memories that she had of Ted specifically. And all of us can relate to these things. We have those exact memories with our cousins coming to visit. And, it's caused me, of course, when I go to family get-togethers now, I'm looking around and I'm saying to myself, do I really know all of these people? Because it's just, you don't know. You can't know what's really going on. People who seem so normal and so good. I mean, Ted really did treat her like a little sister. He was so kind to her. He listened to her. He paid attention to her. He asked her questions. He really loved her dad, which I think is an interesting relationship because he didn't know his own biological father. And I think that Edna's father really had a profound effect on him growing up. And it just really strengthened those familial bonds. And these are really, Edna talks about them, and they're really beautiful memories that are just tinged with what we know now, person
and Anna, when I moved back to Seattle, I got an apartment within 7 or 8 minutes walking distance from where Ted lived. So during that time, he was dropping by all the time. My girlfriends loved him. He came by the apartment, and we thought he was so cool. Here he was, 5 years older. We were all scruffy college students in our, long hair, jeans. And he's been doing these really amazing things, working for the re-election campaign for a very popular Republican governor, Dan Evans. And he goes undercover disguised into the opponent's camp and to pick up all kinds of scoop on what's going on and then reports back. And so then when he comes over to my apartment, he's telling us these stories. So we're sitting around, we're in awe of this guy, and he loves being the center of attention. He just thought that was wonderful that we were all kind of looking up to him. So he's living just a few blocks from me. He drops by. When girls started disappearing right during that significant time, we were all starting to get really terrified. One of the women that was violently attacked but survived lived just across the street and around the corner from me. 3 more of them, Anna, that did not survive were within walking distance of my apartment and where Ted lived. And they were right.
You think Ted was hunting when he was visiting you?
I hate to think that, but I think that, I did not apparently know this guy. So the Ted that I knew, who was frequently dropping by during that time, there was a second part of him that was doing something else. And that's why some of the things now that I look back on, just a few little hints kind of stick out.
Such as?
Well, so one time that he came over, he showed up with a bag of groceries, which, believe me, to starving college students, that was very cool because I was always starving. And so we fixed dinner, and my roommate Margie was there as well. And afterwards we put on music because if anybody knows me, I love to dance. And so we're all dancing around, and I just put on a record and was facing away, and it was kind of a slower song. And when I turn around, he's dancing slowly with Margie, and she's leaning her head against his shoulder. And I look at him, and I saw somebody I didn't recognize. He was looking down at her, just the top of her head, with this really mean, really awful look. Like he was angry, and his jaw was clenched, and his eyes had turned black. And I didn't recognize him. I didn't even know who he was. So much so that I yelled out to him. I said, "Hey, Ted, hey, Ted, are you okay?" And he didn't hear me. I stopped the record and yelled it out again. And then he snapped out of it and looked at me, and it was like as if the mask slipped off his face, and he smiled again. But those blue eyes turning to black was such a weird thing to witness. And then almost within 3 or 4 minutes after that, he said, "I gotta go." And he just turned around and left.
And do you know by any chance, Edna, if that night anyone was murdered?
I don't know. It was the timing. When I look at the timing, it doesn't quite, it's a few months before the beginning of the year. So I don't know if he was out, what he was doing. I think he was really disturbed that the mask, he didn't want us, the family member, to see that side of him. And it was almost as if the mask had slipped just temporarily, and he needed to leave.
That is really chilling.
There are some suspicions, Anna, to your point, that there were murders that happened before the confirmed ones that we know about. And, you know, hitchhikers or other people that are maybe a little harder to identify. And even such that the lead investigator on the case, Bob Keppel, he says that he believes that the just based on what the evidence showed from the confirmed murders, that showed a level of practice, that somebody had been trained well enough already, that these didn't seem to be first-time crimes for whoever had done them.
He was too good at it, right? I mean, not that I want to give him credit for anything, but
it makes it impossible for Edna to know. I mean, and that's such a heartbreaking thing. She looks back on these wonderful memories of her life, and now just with cast that darkness of not really knowing what he was doing when he left her apartment that night.
Yeah.
Do you, either of you, obviously if we had had the type of DNA technology that we have now, that his killing spree would have ended presumably much sooner than it did. Everything has to be in the context of the time.
Right.
And how, there was no internet. There really weren't cell phones. There were, you called the house to make plans to see your friends later that night. Or
you just drop by. Yeah.
Or you drop by.
Yeah.
And beyond that, too, I don't think that communication between police departments really existed then the way that it exists now. And he was smart enough, unfortunately, to spread it around a little bit. He would go to Oregon. He would go to other universities around Washington State. And so he was dealing with lots of different police departments who had these cases on their rosters, and they weren't talking to each other.
They didn't have a national type of way to communicate. Even within jurisdictions within the same state, there wasn't that effective type of communication and sharing of information.
In fact, I think from what I've read, Ted Bundy himself has been part of the reason to rally police departments to start making, larger databases that they could all be a part of and whatnot. So, he changed things for better.
Yes, he did. He did.
Hope so.
I know I'm always conflicted when I describe a killer as charming.
Right.
Because it's hard to imagine that those two things can live within a human body. But that is what makes certain serial killers so very successful.
Exactly. And he was charming. I mean, as I was telling you, my friends really loved him. They loved it when he came over. He was good looking. He was very comfortable talking to people, and he was very engaging, and that was his weapon, because women were attracted to him, and the women that he would reach out to ask for help, they were kind women who offered to help him. And to take advantage of that is just heinous, and that's what he did. He capitalized on that.
Well, just because it's summer, it doesn't mean that you have to cut out all the carb-heavy foods that you love. Hero Bread reinvented the bread and the buns that make summer and fall great. And now you can try their sweet Hawaiian rolls for guilt-free summer sliders. Now, I have a personal favorite. That would be the tortillas. I gotta say, they're delicious, and I make my eggs with them practically every day. So Hero Bread has all of your favorites with no consequences and no compromises, with 0 to 1 gram of net carbs, 0 grams of sugar, and high fiber. Hero Bread is a really easy choice. Plus, they have something for every craving, including sliced bread loaves, buns, and did I mention those tortillas? So keep the carbs out of summer without compromising flavor with Hero Bread. Get 10% off your order at hero.co and use code TRUECRIME at checkout. That's TRUECRIME at hero.co. Before Ted Bundy was identified, do you recall whether you were living with this fear of knowing that there was a killer? Had the term even serial killer been used, or was it all still so very disconnected?
It had not been coined yet. I think it was coined because of him. Megan, do you remember who coined the term serial killer?
I don't remember, but it was around this time period. I mean, a lot of, unfortunately, serial killers were active in the 1970s. And so the phrase became part of our, public discourse pretty quickly after.
Right.
So then the reason I asked that is I remember when I was a young woman, we had a serial killer in the area called Son of Sam.
Oh my gosh, yes.
And he was targeting young brunettes, which I was, and he was targeting in my neighborhood. My neighborhood was one where he had killed.
Oh my God.
And my mother, would not let me out of the house. And so I remember that from that perspective.
Mm-hmm.
You remember being afraid too, or were you just annoyed that your mom wouldn't let you out?
Yeah.
When you're young, you're brazen. You think you can do anything and that you are indestructible. Youth is crazy.
It is.
Right? So I was very aware of certain things. For example, I couldn't walk home late at night. Not that I could anyway, but certain things like darkness and whatever, darkness of day, that had been completely changed. I was very aware of my surroundings, especially again as a brunette, and that was his target. And the whole city, all of New York, was obsessed with Son of Sam, especially between his writings and communications. Son of Sam was bigger than life.
Yeah, it was a big deal.
It was a really big deal. So I think all of New York, any young woman with brown hair felt that way. We felt more so in our neighborhood. So I did change some things, but then I do remember arguing with my mother about not being able to go out at all.
How old were you at that time?
Oh my gosh, I would have been in my 20s.
Okay.
In my early 20s.
Yeah, because we changed our habits as well. We tried to team up so we weren't walking by ourselves. Because I didn't have a car at that time, so I would walk to campus.
Oh, we didn't have a car either. Yeah.
You had great transportation there.
True.
But just getting to campus was maybe 15 minutes to my class on a bicycle. So we try to team up. So we were changing our behavior for sure, because it was basically one a month was disappearing in that really condensed period of time.
Oh my goodness.
And they were targeting women, young girl my age that looked just like us with hair parted down the middle, long hair.
Right.
Yeah. Talked in the past about how popular hitchhiking was at that time period.
Oh, I know it was. My girlfriend once convinced me to do it, and I did it one time, and I never did it again. I thought she was crazy.
I know. I used to do it, if you can believe it.
It was very popular. Everybody hitchhiked back then. Everybody.
Yeah, and then everybody stopped suddenly when that started happening. So you used to see at the freeway entrances maybe 30, 40 people sticking their thumbs out, men, young women, young men, everybody. And then after this started happening, nobody. Everybody.
Yes, which is, I think, a good thing. And definitely a smart move. So I want to bounce around a little bit here, Edna. Okay. So as Ted is continuing on with his education, which is really a cover for, honestly, his killing sprees, that he keeps moving, this moving crime scene. Are you still in touch with him? Because those are the kind of years where everybody gets really busy with their own stuff, starting and embarking on their careers and stuff. So were you still in touch with him at this point?
Yeah, well, so looking at the timeline, in 1974, July was really the last time that he murdered, attacked, kidnapped, and murdered young women in Washington State. Then he got accepted at the University of Utah Law School. And so in the late, the end of the summer in 1974, he moved to, I have to think of the date, he moved to Utah. So he was gone. So he was basically out of my life at that point, and I just went on, got a job and stuff. And then, interestingly, things, and unfortunately and tragically, deaths and very similar types of abductions and murders started happening in and around the Salt Lake City area. But at first, we didn't make the connection because, again, the news didn't necessarily make its way up here.
Instead, it was like, poor Ted, everywhere he goes. It's a dangerous place to be. Poor Ted.
Yeah, you know what? That's interesting you should say that, because when he finally was arrested, we thought that exact thing. We thought wrong place, wrong time, that must be mistaken identity. Not just us, the family, but the professors he had, his friends, his co-workers, a political reporter that came to like him, who was an investigative reporter at our state capitol, and the governor of our state, whose election campaign he worked on, wrote him letters of recommendation. None of us could believe he was the right guy. It must have been a terrible mistake.
At what point did you realize? And I know it takes a long time to process it, but initially, the first time it actually hit you.
Well, let's see. How do I concisely explain this? Because I had received a phone call when I was up in Alaska. I was working on a crab processing ship out in the middle of the Aleutian Islands.
As one does, yes.
As one often does. You have to realize what the economy was. I graduated from college with a major in history, so of course I would work on a crab processing plant in Alaska. Isn't that what all history majors do? I mean,
yes.
So this was October of 1975. And I'm called up to the bridge and I get a phone call, and it's my brother. And that's when I found out he was arrested for the attempted kidnapping of I believe it was Carol DeRange. Is that who it was? Yeah.
Yeah.
And I couldn't believe it. I thought, there's just no way. This is just a terrible, terrible mistake. So when I got back from Alaska at the end of the Alaska king crab season, this would have been December of the same year, 1975, one of my top priorities was I had to talk to Ted. And he was out on bail at that point and back in Seattle. And so I got together with him. And I still wasn't ready. I wanted him to deny it and say, hey, this is terrible. What I'm going through with this is just awful. I wanted him to say all those things. But instead, I got a completely different reaction. I met him up for lunch, and I was with a group of other coworkers. We'd all come back from Alaska. We were sharing our, battle scars and our stories of survival, because it was not an easy thing being up there during that time. And I invited Ted to join me. I said, hey, I want to see you, but I have this commitment to meet up with people. Do you want to come along? And he said yes. And at the end of the conversation, one of the guys there says, so Ted, what's your last name? And he said, he kind of sat up a little straighter and he said, that's Ted Bundy. And this young man looked at him awestruck, like he was some kind of, don't you, I mean, when I told it to you, Megan, didn't he seem like he was acting like Ted was some kind of a superstar?
Yeah.
And
at that point. So
Ted his chest just went out and he was just acted like he was really proud. And that's the first thing when I went, oh no, that's not how you act when you're innocent. And so we left right after that. And I was starting to get concerned, but got in the car. And that's when I asked him outright, Ted, are you responsible for doing this, kidnapping these women, murdering these women? And he said, oh, of course not. It's just a case of mistaken identity. And it's just, just a terrible thing. And I was so relieved.
Oh, wow.
But that's not the end of it. I had to go to the store, to the university bookstore, and get something. I wish I remember what I wanted to get. I can't remember. But it was, the university bookstore has all kinds of stuff besides books, all kinds of stuff. So I went there, left Ted in the car, in the parking, in the parking lot behind the building. And I'm getting my stuff. I'm at the cash register, and I can see out the window all these people kind of running down past the window towards the end of the block and pointing and stuff. And I get a bad feeling. So I go out the front door, head down to the block, and I'm at the stoplight, and I can see people across the street milling around something across the street on the corner. And then the people part a little bit, and it's Ted. And he's standing on the corner with his arms held out like a messiah, and slowly turning and proclaiming in a loud voice, as if he were in a trance. He goes, "I'm Ted Bundy. I'm," over and over again, "I'm Ted Bundy." And people are starting to get hostile and people are getting upset. And I'm freaking out because at that very moment, it made me realize that somebody who's innocent would not have done that. He was absolutely loving the reaction that he was getting and how people were looking at him. So I worked my way through the crowd and had to shove people aside to get up to him, and I slapped my hand over his mouth to shut him up. And I hauled him around behind the building and threw him in the car. And I got to drive him home. And that's when I realized I'm in the car alone with a serial killer. And that's when it hit me, and that I didn't know him. I didn't know who this person was, and I was terrified. And when I was driving along thinking, God, what am I going to do? I hope I can get him home before anything happens. And I turned and I looked at him, and he's just looking back at me and smiling. And then I knew, oh my God, what if he tries to attack me? What if he does something? And then I started planning, I'll just wreck this car. I'll just take my beautiful Ford Squire wagon that I was so proud of because it was my first car, and I will just crash it into the wall or into another car. I'll do anything if he tries to get me. And he did not do anything. But when I got to his girlfriend's house,
oh boy,
which is where he wanted me to drop him off, I pulled up and he just looked at me. We didn't even say anything. I looked back at him, he looked at me, and he just kind of nodded and got out of the car, swung his legs around, and walked in the house. And I just went,
the last time you saw him?
that was the last time that I physically saw him, yeah.
Wow.
Or that I was in his presence.
In his presence. So, Megan, what do you make of a moment like that and that attention-seeking display that he had in the parking lot?
It's interesting because Edna has other stories from earlier. For instance, when she mentioned earlier that he would like to stop by the house and talk about his exploits working on his political campaigns and that he liked to talk to people, he was showing signs, I think, even then that he really liked this attention. He liked to be in the spotlight. That was something that he really did value in his life. So there's getting attention for good things, and then there's getting attention for terrible things, and they're very, very different. It's interesting, because myself and I'm sure a lot of other people have watched, all these documentaries with Ted, and we see a lot of the footage from the trial, for instance, when he's representing himself in court. And Edna's story, I think, really shows what we see in those later tapes when he's kind of a peacock. He's really loving that attention. He's really loving being the center of everybody, the cameras and all of that stuff. And, the fact that he is there because he murdered all of these women is a side point to him. I think at that point, he really does just enjoy that attention. It's an interesting thing to sort of see through the coming of age through his earlier years too, being this boy who was born out of wedlock and, getting to know the area and Edna's family and, really getting to know, Edna's father, I think, was somebody, he was a concert pianist, and he traveled on tour a lot all over the world. And I think that Ted sort of saw something in that and saw this life and saw, something that he wanted to make himself. He wanted to be somebody. And this is what we got. This is the somebody that he made himself to be. But you know what? We're still talking about him. Yeah. And I don't know how to think about that. It's complicated.
It is. It's really complicated. It is very complicated. I think because of his prominence and his infamy in criminal history, modern criminal history, that is why he is so studied and dissected. Yes, I know this obsession with Ted Bundy. I'm curious, Edna, when he finally really was revealed to be the monster that he was, and I know that took some time.
Yeah.
Was his mother, your aunt, still alive?
Yeah, actually, she's my first cousin because, and he's my first cousin once removed. My father was the youngest of 7 kids, and so his oldest sibling, by the time he had kids, one of them, Louise, she was only 4 years younger.
Got it.
So then that's why Ted and my generation are the same. But yes, his mother was still alive. His poor mom had to go through all of this, and she really adored him. I mean, he was he had so much potential. That's the sad thing about it too, because he was, not only was he working in politics and very successful at it, but he was working for the Seattle Crime Commission on how, different projects to prevent crime against women. He wrote a pamphlet on rape prevention for women.
I can't.
Can you? Yeah.
I can't.
So,
honestly, I can't.
To his mind while he was writing that, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, but at that time we were in awe of him, thinking, God, he's doing all these incredible things for women at a time that we were at a crucial tipping point for women in America. It was the women's movement was just at its birth at that time. We were all feeling incredibly excited about it, and this possibility of empowerment. And so here's this put together guy who's doing these good works, we think, for women. But it was also a time, I think, where a lot of resentment towards women was taking place too. And I don't know if there's any connection with that to what he was doing, but it's just the potential that was lost. He had all these things going for him, and yet he chose, whether willfully or maybe he'd had no choice, I don't know, to be a monster like that instead.
And so his mother was still, I guess, was she supportive? I mean, that's a really hard one on a family. So your son is being accused of being a horrific murderer.
Yeah.
And what do you do?
Yeah, she was a gentle soul, Louise Bundy was. And my father had a lot of affection for her. That the relationship that they had was very similar to the relationship that Ted and I had because of the age difference. And Ted would treat me like a little sister, I mean, he had 2 other sisters who he loved, but Louise was terrible on her. I mean, she would show up for a lot of the trials, and I think she hoped longer than anybody that there was a mistake, that her son couldn't be the person doing this. And I know that it broke her heart.
So Ted, I mean, part of the reason I think people are also fascinated is like Ted's escape from prison, his jail escape.
Yeah.
It's like, how is this possible? And now there's a killer out there.
These were little tiny jails, right? I mean, they were a small town jail in Colorado. Everybody wonders about that. I mean,
yeah.
The first time he jumps out of a window, while he's in the law, and he's representing himself, so he has special privileges.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think it comes down to he really he knew how to disarm people. And I think he could even disarm the people who were supposed to be, keeping him locked away in these jails too. Like in that instance, he, as Edna said, he was representing himself. So he had special permissions to go to the law library to do research for his own trial. And he took advantage of it. He, jumped out a window and was, living rough in the mountains for, I think, 2 weeks before he finally got caught. So it wasn't exactly a well-planned thing, but he took advantage of it. But
it worked. He got out.
It worked.
Yes.
He got out. Absolutely. I mean, it's really remarkable. The second time he got out, Edna actually has a really great story about that because he called her on the phone the day before he escaped that night. So I would actually like to let Edna tell the story because it's
Yeah. So I had not communicated with Ted for a year. So this was 1977. I'll get the date right. It was December 30th of 1977. And so it's just the day before New Year's Eve, New Year's Eve. So you get a call. The phone rings. You don't have caller ID or anything like that. And apparently he had phone privileges. I think he had a phone card because he was supposed to be able to do research. Again, he's in the prison the second time, but it's another small jail. And he calls me, and first of all, I'm really shocked that it's Ted on the phone, and I'm wary.
Since that moment when he was doing the street corner Messiah thing, like this was the first time you'd spoken to him since then.
Yeah, that was the first time I'd spoken to him or hadn't written to him, had anything, because I was just floored by what he'd done. And he wanted to know, he asked me, he said, well, what would you think if I escaped? And I, of course, I wasn't expecting that question from him. And I said, well, I think it would be a very bad idea. You know, that don't do it. The last time you tried it, it didn't work out for you, did it, Ted? You know, so
oh, God.
I said, this is, go through trial and go through the proper procedure. Don't do that. And then he went on to disparage my brother and tell me that he was the weird one, not him, which was not true, and that he should have been the one in jail, which made no sense whatsoever. And that was when the conversation ended, and I hung up thinking, God, that was a weird call. It never crossed my mind that he would actually do it. He also called my brother that right after he called me and asked the same question, except he went one step further. He asked John, my brother John, what the worst states were for the death penalty. And my brother...
Well, he's in the law library. He should be able to answer that himself, even though we didn't have Google back then.
They didn't have Google, but, there's lots of ways to find out. Probably ask one of the jailers there. They would know. But, and my brother said, well, gosh, the worst states are... And maybe he asked him this before he told him he was thinking about escaping. He says, well, the worst states are Texas and Florida. And then I think then he tells him he's thinking about escaping. And my brother was, oh my God, don't do that. I mean, neither one of us were fans of him doing that at all. And then it was the next morning that he escaped. He had lost so much weight on purpose that he crawled up through an air vent. Now, what's going on with air vents big enough in a jail cell that you can crawl up through it?
I think he'd been chiseling away, if I remember right. Like he'd been chiseling away to make it big enough, but still your point is still a good point.
Yeah, and I think he'd been doing some practice runs in there too. And of course they thought it was raccoons or something. I don't know, squirrels.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And so did the FBI come calling?
They certainly did, because we were awakened very early in the morning, because they don't come at a reasonable time. They want to make sure that you're there. Dawn and I were awakened at the crack of dawn by pounding on the front door. And at that time, we lived in a little trailer. We had been this beautiful house that my husband had built for his client. And we scrambled to get a rental, and the only thing we found was this little trailer. So when they pounded on the door, the whole place shook. And my husband... we were kind of concerned because it was still dark out. And he went and opened up the door, and it was the FBI. And that's how we found out he had escaped. And they, of course, wanted to make sure that we were not planning, because they knew that I had talked to him the night before. But they didn't know what we talked about, because they couldn't they did not listen in on the call.
That doesn't make sense. I thought all those calls were monitored.
Again, he had special privileges. He had this phone card because he was representing himself, and that made it so that the police guards or the prison guards couldn't actually listen in on the conversations, couldn't record the conversation. Edna didn't know that at the time. She thought it was.
Yeah. And the other thing I didn't know, that somehow he had, $500 or $600? I mean, people had given him money, and, he got out, and somehow he made it to far enough away where he could catch a bus, and then he got to an airport and then flew from there. And back then, of course, They didn't have the TSA. You didn't have to produce
ID.
ID.
Yeah.
You didn't have a credit card. It's okay. You could pay cash.
But I think, Anna, to bring this out, because I think this is pretty chilling. The FBI showed up at Edna's door saying, "Is he here? Don't aid and abet this fugitive.
Right.
I think he might come here." And Edna's now left with that possibility. Like, he might come here. The FBI think he could come here, and he's at large for like 40 plus days. And every single one of those days, Edna and her family, she has a 1-year-old daughter at this point, are living in fear that he's going to show up at this trailer at any time.
Yeah. And so I was afraid to stay there during the day. And meanwhile, my husband is amassing weapons. We did not have any guns, but he was hiding knives, axes, all kinds of things. At night, because if he came, he wanted to be able to defend us. And he was wedging the door shut, bracing it with, 2x4s so that he couldn't open the door in the middle of the night. That's how scared we were. And then during the day, I would hide out with friends. I had friends that were living on a boat. And so I would take my baby at the time. She turned 1, the day that this was all happening.
When the FBI showed up.
When the FBI showed up. And so we would spend every day on their boat. And we'd pull out and be in the middle of the harbor or cruising off the islands. And there would be no way he could get us out there. And that's how worried we were, how scared I was.
And this went on until he was captured.
Yeah, pretty much.
In Florida, which is one of the states that Edna's brother gave him as,
that's kind of weird, isn't it?
Yeah.
I thought it was Florida, and I'm like, wait a second.
Yep.
So when he is finally convicted and put to death, and sentenced to death, did you resume any communications with him? At this point, now you are, thank goodness in many ways that your name publicly was not Bundy. So you could, to some degree, fly a little bit more under the radar than other family members.
Mm-hmm. I was very fortunate that way because we were very fearful that the press would find us. So I started writing him letters. And when he was and that was when he was sentenced to death, is when I started writing him letters. And those letters are in the book, and they've never been seen. And that's when I went after him, because I said, "Hey, look, Ted, you are going to die. There's no way out for you. Maybe you could do something now for the families, maybe get some kind of redemption for the horrific things you have done, because there are still families that have not been able to find the remains of their daughters." And that just disturbed me so profoundly that they couldn't even bring them home and bury them. And so I went after him, and those letters we wrote back and forth, and they're, he denied it. There's all kinds of things in there where he said he has no fear, guilt, or remorse for anything he's done.
He said that what's done is done.
What's done is done.
The letters are chilling. They're chilling, really, truly.
It's like another moral injury. While we're talking about, and this is a very narrow conversation we're having, is from your perspective,
right,
and your family's perspective, which just gives some insight into the killer. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, the people who have absolutely suffered are the ones whose loved ones were taken in the most brutal way, those who don't know, and that not knowing, these families have been destroyed by the actions of your cousin.
It's right.
And how do you not just process that, but where does that live in the compartments of your heart and your soul? My cousin, who I adored.
I did.
How do you reconcile all of that and what he has done?
I don't think you do. For the last 50 years, I have taken great pains not to be associated with him. I didn't want anybody to know that he was my cousin. I was ashamed of it, as well as just horrified and sickened by what he'd done. I mean, it's my own burden to carry, and I carried this burden for all this time, and that's really a main motivation for writing this book, was to get Ted out of my system. I didn't want him controlling me anymore, and also to keep the narrative alive about these families that are still suffering. I mean, they still don't have a way to put to rest their loved ones. But it's a really a difficult deal to have that kind of a relationship.
Yeah, I don't. I just.
And I can only imagine what it's like for his siblings.
Right.
I mean, he messed up a lot of people very profoundly, and I don't. That's why I wrote it, to write from the perspective of a family member, because people always wonder what the family is like. Well, I mean, most of us are pretty normal people, and like the same things, and just trying to live our lives, and to have this guy who's just so deceptive and manipulative and cruel to be part of it.
A demon, evil monster.
Yes. And that he was welcomed into my home, and I exposed my friends to him. One of my roommates, one of her best friends, was one of his victims. That was Linda Ann Healy. And she can't, and I understand this completely, she can't even talk about it to this day. It still devastates her so much. And why wouldn't it? I mean, it was such a horrific thing to happen, to find out one of your friends was just plucked and removed from her life.
And until recently, Edna, you felt the same way. You couldn't talk about it either.
No.
You avoided it. You didn't want anybody to know who you were.
I didn't want anybody to know. It was so stressful for me even to decide to write this book, that I was meeting with the woman who became my publicist, who's also a good friend of Megan's. And my daughter and I were sitting across from her in the restaurant, and I had written up my pitch and given it to her. And it was the first time I had really talked in depth to anybody else, or had disclosed a lot of these personal things to someone. And I was so stressed out while I was talking to her, and she's right across from me, that a blood vessel burst in my eye.
Oh my God.
And she told me just a couple days ago that she'd taken her phone below the table, and she was madly Googling up this thing, hoping it wasn't a medical emergency.
Right.
And, did she need to call 911 or anything? And turned out not to be a medical emergency. But that's how stressed out I was. It wasn't until we got out to the parking lot, and my daughter and I were hugging each other goodbye, and she looked at me and she goes, "Oh my God, what happened to your eye?" And that is how hard it was for me to talk about it.
This is one of the things, if I can jump in for 1 second, that drew me to this project myself, and why I find Edna so inspiring, because, this is something that she's lived with, this shadow, for 50 years, and it's been something that she has not wanted people to know about. She's avoided talking about him. And it's not just her, it's her kids, it's her daughter, it's, grandchildren, like the trauma.
Yeah, generational.
It keeps going down, even though her daughter never met Ted, he's lived like this phantom in her life too. And it's just, he continues to have this presence. And by Edna deciding to finally come out of the shadows and finally tell her story that she has a right to tell, in my opinion, it's her dismissing, it's not letting him dominate her life anymore. It's taking control, and it's saying, this is who I am. This is what my story is. And I find that incredibly empowering and inspiring. So I just have to say, it's a huge act of courage for Edna to come out. And I think it's really wonderful.
What has the result been? I know you have this book, but what has the public reaction been? And have you been surprised by it?
Well, the book is due out July 23rd. And so we're getting a lot of interest. A lot of people want to know about it. And of course, everybody that we mention it to, because now I'm much more comfortable talking about this, everybody is pretty amazed that I grew up with him. So, yeah, there's a lot of interest and a lot of curiosity about it, for sure.
I would say it's been pretty sympathetic, though, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I've had a lot of support. There's been one or two people that wonder, are you trying to profit off of this? And obviously, I'm not. I mean, I waited 50 years to talk about this, and my motivation for writing it was to get it out of my system, to talk about it from our perspective. I majored in history, so historical things are important to me, and this unfortunately is part of history. So I'm just adding my little bit to this narrative. And of course, these letters are just never before seen, and they are pretty amazing. So I think that's where we are, is just trying to add something to the story so people can understand from the family's point of view what it was like.
It's so interesting. It brings us back to the very, very first question, the question that everyone asks, how did the family not know? And we're going through that now with a case on Long Island with the man who's called the Gilgo Beach serial killer, Rex Heuermann, his wife and two kids. The town and the media and everyone's gone after them. Like, how could they not know? How could they not know? It's a little different in the sense, here was this successful architect who lived in a house that no successful architect would live in. I mean, the house in itself was a creepy house that the neighborhood and the children were afraid of. So, and then when you find out that a serial killer, an accused serial killer lived there, you're like, because that's what you expect, and he's been described differently than Ted Bundy was described. Mm-hmm. Other people who claim to have had interactions with him, have described him as an ogre because of his size and other things. And so it's a different way of describing two serial killers, one convicted, one accused, who denies it, and he's not gone to trial yet. But so many people went after his wife and his kids.
Yeah.
And it's a different time now where you have social media and you have more access to things. Your family didn't experience it to the level that this wife and children are experiencing.
Well, we didn't. I think maybe Louise's family might have. I don't know. Although I think that the people that knew them were very supportive of Louise and the kids, because Ted was an expert at living two separate lives. And he did that so effectively, and he fooled us. I mean, I loved him. I hung out with him. I went places with him alone. I went out dancing with him alone one night. I rode around in his car, the infamous VW Bug.
Oh, boy.
During that time that he was using it to transport his victims. I was in that car.
Oh.
And I had no idea. And because he epitomized the up and coming young man who was on his way to a great career. So he was very, very adept at performance arts, acting, wearing a mask. He was quite good at it, very good at it.
And then I have talked a lot too about this idea of, I think she even called it familial immunity, I think is her phrase, which, makes perfect sense if you think about it. And it makes me have so much more sympathy for all the families, like the family of the Gilgo Beach killer and whatnot too. I think that when you're a family member or a good friend of somebody like this, I think you're actually more blind to it than other people, because you think that you know them. You think you know them better than the police do. You think you know them, in their core, in their soul. And as such, it's so much harder to take that blinder away and to actually see who this person is and what this person has done. And, Edna had that very remarkable experience where she saw Ted on the street corner with his arms out. And I think that moment actually marked her turn, just that turn, to be able to take the blinders off and actually see who this person was. She, in a lot of ways, she started that process before most of the other members of the family. So she started to see him for who he was before her parents did, before other members of, her family were able to. So it was a really chilling moment, but in a lot of ways it was a great thing for Edna because it helped her to do that. I think about all of the members of these other families out there, of course, they're not going to want to see that. That's the last thing in the world that they're going to want to believe. And so they're just going to look for every possible reason to not have to see that, to not have to believe that. So you'd think, the people who know these people best would be the best judges of character. And in fact, they're probably the worst. It's probably the hardest for them.
Yeah. And I do think I think Ted was really good at this, being somebody completely different around his family. He never wanted to cross over and let one part of his life ever bleed over into the other, to use a terrible analogy, into the other part of his life. And I, in talking to different people and some experts who work with people who have lived marginal lives, and then they go home and they're just regular family people. They're moms, they're dads, they're fixing dinner, they're taking the kids to, school. And yet they're living this other life where they're doing these completely different things that their family doesn't know about when they're away from home. And I believe that's what Ted was doing.
They are skilled at hiding. And that is why they get away with it for so long. Yes, absolutely. This has just been a fascinating conversation. This really has been. Do you, Edna, do you feel at all lighter, like any part of you has been released or something?
It's been very helpful because the fact I'm able to talk to you, Anna, about this is absolutely amazing to me, because I would have been stumbling over my words and having a very hard time talking about this if this were a couple years ago before I started writing the book. And writing is a very cathartic exercise because it's slow. You're slowly getting everything out of your system and in expressing yourself. And that has been a tremendous experience for me. So I'm glad to have done it.
And was there any personal revelation for yourself, Megan? Because when you are writing and so become deeply attached to the people that you are writing about and with, sometimes, you have your own personal experiences. Was there any either revelation or some process or something that happened to you?
Absolutely. I mean, we've touched on a lot of them already, but, one of the biggest things is really just, when I first met Edna, I knew I was going to meet Ted Bundy's cousin. I'd never met her before. And, she'd never really wanted to talk about this. I didn't really know what I was going to be walking in the room to, I didn't know how damaged she was going to be. And I walk in and you can see her right now. She's a lovely, wonderful, normal person, very generous, and to her credit, very willing to talk to me, a total stranger, about this stuff. So kudos to her. But, that's also very eye-opening because it goes right back to all the stuff that we've been talking about. This happens in normal families, this happens to people who you would never believe that this kind of thing could happen to. So as we've gone into all of the parts of her story, there's things that are so relatable, and the relatableness of it, I think, is actually really terrifying.
I think you're right.
But yeah, of course, all of it, just being able to see Ted's letters to her and all of this stuff across the board, it's been an incredible experience to feel like, you can kind of shed a little bit more light on this story that we all think that we know so much about. Edna offers this new perspective, this new angle on it.
Yeah, and one of the things too is that it has made me more analytical. Maybe I'm trying to think of the words, because after that, I realized I couldn't 100% trust my own ability to judge people.
Oh, how scary. I bet that would. Like, I'd be like,
Yes.
oh my God, my cousin was a serial killer. Like,
Right.
clearly my radar,
Yeah.
my intuition is so off. I don't know what to think.
Yeah, you exactly. And so you trust them, but don't be deceived by them. And then, and I talk to a lot of young women who are out walking and they've got 2 earbuds in their ears.
Most dangerous thing to do.
Oh my God. And I so agree with you, Anna. And I come up behind them and I'll say something, they can't hear me. And finally they'll pull out the earbud. And I'm going, I have a story to tell you. And you should be aware of you should have situational awareness, especially when you're out walking by yourself. And I hope that comes across too, because it is, you just never know.
That's
So
definitely
agreed.
one of the big lessons. Yeah, that the actionable take home points that I've learned from this is that I am very much more aware of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then I've talked a lot about this idea that like we're invincible, but that doesn't mean we're invulnerable. We have to be smart. And I think that's a good lesson for everybody to learn.
Right.
That is like number one. We had a former FBI agent who was assistant to the counterterrorism unit and has worked serial killer cases. He's specializing in serial killers who are truck drivers. And he said, the one thing for everyone here, it's like your situational awareness. Please do not walk with those. Any kind of headphones, AirPods, whatever, because that makes you so vulnerable.
It does.
You can't hear anyone coming up behind you.
You can't. I walked right up behind these young women. They did not hear me.
Oh, it's so frightening.
Yeah.
And none of this walking in a park alone, none of this running alone, go in a super populated area. We say it over and over and over again, but I can't tell you how many cases I cover where it is at those points and those moments where women are abducted and are harmed. Just awful. But this has been such an interesting journey.
Yeah.
I wish you much luck with the book, Dark Tide, Growing Up with Ted Bundy.
Thank you.
You're lovely. I'm sorry for everything that your family has had to endure because of Ted Bundy's murderous actions. Obviously, it in no way compares to what the survivors and the victims and their families have gone through.
Exactly.
But I think we don't always in the conversation have a moment for the other innocent people who had nothing to do with it, but somehow the public and community accuses them and punishes them for things that they did not do.
That's right. Exactly.
So
thank you for the opportunity to tell my story.
Thank you.
Appreciate
It's been such a pleasure. Such a pleasure. Thank you. Much success with the book. So thank you, everyone. This has been a special edition of True Crime News, the podcast. You can find this episode, all our episodes, wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also, subscribe to our newsletter at our website, True Crime News. Our handle on all social media is My True Crime News. Mine is at Ana G News with one N. So thank you, everyone. And as we always say at the end of the podcast, don't do crime.